This beautiful piece of art is the 1853 Enfield rifled musket. Now this is of course a reproduction. This is not an authentic one from over 150 years ago, as you can tell by the Italian manufacturer's stamp here at the top of the barrel. Needless to say, this is more or less exact to the make and model of an actual 1853 Enfield rifled musket. Now, one of the key things about the Enfield that was an improvement from the flintlock was the first introduction was the use of this little brass cap with fulminated mercury inside of it, known as the percussion cap. It was invented by a Scottish minister in the 1850s and patented by him. Although there have been many historical arguments that there were other versions of this produced before the Scottish Reverend made his, but his is most well known, and credit is given to him as far as this model's make. Now, what this percussion cap does is, back with the flintlock muskets, there was a hammer, as you see, similar to this, but instead here it pinched a small piece of flint. Then there was a metal protruding instrument here that when the trigger was released, the hammer would strike, the flint would create a spark rubbing against the metal bit, and the spark would go into the chamber where the powder was, and the spark would ignite the powder, shooting the musket ball out the barrel. But one of the key issues with the flintlock is the flintlock was very unreliable and was known for not firing, especially if it was rainy. One of the other things as to why the Scottish minister made the percussion cap was there was a slight pause in between the time of the flint creating a spark and then the eventual powder igniting, when the minister himself was a hunter. And so what he noticed was that the ducks would fly seeing the smoke before the musket discharged its round. Whereas this, it's a simple 1-2 boom, as opposed to the 1-2 boom with that slight delay with the flintlock. One of the other key developments with the Enfield rifle is the use of this cartridge here, this paper cartridge. Now, by the 1840s or such, they had similar concepts with this. You see these especially in the American frontiers sometimes, but it became more prominent and official with the Enfield. Instead of having to measure out the powder, a small amount of powder to put inside the little tray of the flintlock and then pour the rest down the barrel, all the powder went down the barrel of the Enfield. Now, one of the things with the Enfield is this cartridge contained powder, and at the bottom was this lead ball known as a mini ball. It was invented by a German weaponsmith named Alfred Menet, hence why it's called the mini ball. Now, what this allowed you to do is this would eventually lead to the full brass cartridges that we see in modern day weapons with the primer in here. The only difference, so in essence, the modern day cartridges that you see with rounds contain all three: projectile, explosive, and primer. The only difference, this cartridge contains only ammunition and powder. You had to put the primer up at the top to create ignition. One of the other key developments in the Enfield rifle was, as opposed to the flintlock musket, was that all Enfields were rifled. Rifled meaning inside of this barrel there are small circular grooves that what that does is as the bullet is pushed out the barrel from the explosion of the powder, it gets a bit of a spiraling spin to it. This gives it more accuracy as well as range. Think of it almost in the concept of a football thrower throwing his football. You see a football thrower throw his football, there's that spiral on it. It gives him more distance and more precision to make it to the receiver. Think of how much further a quarterback, such as Tom Brady, can throw his football as opposed to a baseball pitcher, such as like CC Sabathia. He has more distance as well as more precision. Same concept applies to the introduction of the rifle. Now, there were, say for example, during the Napoleonic Wars, there were rifled muskets. You have the 95th British Rifles, who were sharpshooters, but the thing is, rifles were few and far between as they were issued only to sharpshooters. Reason being, rifling, especially during the day of Napoleon, when, although you have the industrialization in Britain and Europe, it's not as prominent as by the 1850s. So what that means is producing flintlock muskets, which have smooth bore, where it's just the barrel, inside the barrel is just smooth. It's just simply a quick push of the bullet out without that spiral in the rifling, making it less accurate. That's why you see the common tactics of the Napoleonic War, where I'm going to line my troops up in one line, you're going to line your troops up in one line, and if there's 50 of my troops and they all shoot down one direction, well, if we're at least 50 yards, then hopefully at least 35 of my 50 will actually hit our targets, because they were not as accurate as Hollywood likes to portray them for the most part. That's why you see the tactics of the day were line formation, because the flintlock muskets only had an effective range more or less of about 50 yards. Now, that is the exception. There are flintlock rifles, but those were few and far between, especially in the armies of Britain and France during the Napoleonic Wars. Whereas opposed to the Enfield, this Enfield rifle has an effective range of between 200 to about 150, actually, about 150 yards to about 200 yards. Now, that's a give or take. There are some exceptions, especially when into the science of shooting and accuracy and all that stuff. But for a safe number, their effective range is between 150 to 200 yards, with there being exceptions as well. So what that means also is that you see, especially in the American Civil War, where the Enfield rifle was an issued rifle on both the Union and Confederate sides, is you see the mass carnage in numbers. There were over 600,000 men killed on both sides combined, which is more casualties than you see in all other wars in America. Now, but the reason being is because we have advanced technology, but the tactics had not caught up with the technology. They're still using the tactics that were used in the Napoleonic Wars some 50 years prior to the Civil War. But I digress. So this, of course, you'll see up here, there is the crown right here. That's to symbolize that it was tested in London. The London Armory has approved this rifle, and it is good for combat use. Now, one of the key interesting things is this cartridge you see here. This is the reason for the Sepoy Rebellion in 1857. Reason being is to protect the ammunition, which is made of paper, from moisture, as well as to help lubricate the round, because most of the time when you're trying to push the round down the barrel, the round does not fit in as smoothly as this one does. This is an exception. So what the British did to solve this problem was they laced these rounds with pig and or cow fat, which of course was highly offensive to the Muslim and Hindu soldiers of the sepoy, because the reason being is in order to fire this weapon, there's 9 steps. The first step is to draw a cartridge. One would reach into their ammunition pouch on their waist belt or from their shoulder pouch. Next would be tear a cartridge. They would place the cartridge inside their mouth and they would tear it with their 2 front teeth. That's why in the U.S. Army during the Civil War, the only real medical requirement in order to join was you had to prove you had 4 front teeth. That's actually an interesting fact, because still in the Army today, if you are denied entrance into the Army because of medical reason, they stamp 4F, same as it was in Civil War, meaning 4F, you don't have 4 front teeth. Now, this placing of the cartridge in one's mouth to tear the cartridge to expose the powder, to pour the powder down, that was highly offensive to the Muslim and Hindu soldiers of the sepoys because they were putting pig and or cow fat into their mouth, which their religion prohibited, which led to the Sepoy Mutiny, which led to Britain sending in troops to crush the Sepoy Mutiny, and Parliament disbanding the British East India Company and incorporating India into full-fledged colony of the British Empire, with its own viceroy and Queen Elizabeth taking on the title of Empress of India, as well as her many other titles. So, after one draws cartridge, tear cartridge, they rip off this little paper bit, exposing the powder and the lead ball. This is a blank round, no live ammunition right now. They would then be told to charge cartridge. They would pour the powder down the barrel, getting it all the way down there. And by this point, they would be exposing the lead ball, which would be about here. Then what they would do is they would be told to draw a rammer. They would pull out the ramrod, then ram cartridge, shoving that ramrod down, because the idea is you want to pack that mini ball as close, a mini ball and powder, in close to the primer as possible, so that when the primer ignites, the spark in the chamber will cause the powder to explode and push the round out the barrel. So you want to have that as tightly packed in the chamber as possible. Next, you would retrieve rammer, and then you would put the ramrod back in. Now, this ramrod was almost as important to this rifle as the trigger is. The reason being is if this ramrod bends or breaks, this rifle is useless. Now, one of the key things you'll notice when I do this, I use my pinky finger because there's a little bit of pressure pushing the ramrod all the way back in. So what I do is I use my pinky. Now, the reason being is there are both American and British manuals saying to do this, because the idea was if I use my full hand, which may seem a bit obvious choice, and there's a misfire, I may lose my hand. As you see, my hand is right over the barrel where there is a loaded round inside the chamber. So they say to use the pinky. The reason being is if there's a misfire, I lose my pinky. Pinkies are replaceable, are expendable in the Army. So that's why I use my pinky to push all the way back. Next, I would be given the order to draw a primer. I reach into my percussion cap pouch, which is on my waist belt as well, and place my percussion cap on the nipple of the weapon. I'll then go to the shoulder arms, and then if I was British, I would be told present, at which place I would place the weapon facing downrange and take my sights along the barrel. If I was American, I'd be told make ready, aim, and then if I was American, I'd be told fire, whereas the British would have a 4-count to fire. There are some instances, though, they would be given the command fire as well. So those are to each unit. And then I would have to repeat all those 9 steps. Now, those are 9 steps as opposed to the flintlock, which we require more along 13 to 15 steps. And that is the Enfield rifle. Now, one last element of this rifle, which Hollywood, of course, loves to display, is this 18-inch triangular bladed bayonet. Now, historians will argue as to its effectiveness by the 1850s. It had more prominent effect with the age of flintlocks, because flintlocks being so inaccurate, it would be more likely that we would get into a line of 50 yards, fire a 1 or 2 rounds, and then we would fix bayonets and charge at one another at 50 yards. Whereas now, these Enfields, we have a range of about 150 to 200 yards. Now, each soldier is expected to get off at least 3 rounds per minute. Now, with that rate, at 150 yards, there is less likely chance that you are going to be able to get this close to me to stab me. I will more likely be than able to get off at least 3 rounds, one of which will hit you in some point of your body, than you are to get to stab me. However, especially during the 1850s, the bayonet did have one use, which was used a lot during the Battle of Waterloo, especially, which was to protect one's unit from cavalry. What the British would do, especially during Waterloo, you see this if you watch the movie Waterloo. The movie Waterloo does a great job of displaying this. What the British would do is they would form defensive squares of 2 to 3 ranks deep. The first rank kneeling, placing their bayonets up at a 45-degree angle. The second rank above them with their bayonets at waist level, and then the third rank behind them for support. Horses, of course, would not charge into these, being sharp and pointy. They, fearing their own life, would not do such, and that would render the cavalry ineffective. Same aspect was applied to the Seapoint Mutiny. When you had the Punjab cavalry come in, the British would form their defensive squares and got off a couple of rounds, and they could do nothing they could not penetrate the defensive squares, being porcupine-like. And that is the Enfield rifle with this last attachment. During the Civil War, less than 1% of all battlefield casualties resulted from the bayonet. Soldiers of the Americans being somewhat less experienced than the British, being that most American soldiers during the Civil War were not professional soldiers, rather volunteers, local volunteers. They figured the best way to use this, especially in close combat, was as a giant 4-foot club. They would use this backside. Bayonet charges resulted, of course, in less than 1% of all casualties. The soldiers of the Civil War did find, however, was if they put this in the ground, I could put a candle right in here and use it as a night lamp. That was the primary use, or I could use it for shish kebabbing. I personally have done that with the bayonet, and it was quite useful. So, this rifle had very real implications to British imperialism. Because of this, India and present-day Pakistan were incorporated into the British Empire with the dissolution of the British East India Company, giving England, or Britain, its crown jewel, the Empire of India.